Good afternoon.
Pode começar, Jean.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jean Damlakis. I'm a professor at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Today we host Dr. Ranjan Sen on Abralim ao Vivo, Linguists Online. He will present his talk, Feeling the Irresistible Latin Beat, the Role of Grammar in Sound Change. Abralim ao Vivo, Linguists Online is a joint project of Abralim, Associação Brasileira de Linguística, and several international associations, including the Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, the Associación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, da Sociedade Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, da Sociedade Espanhola de Linguística, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Societas Linguística Europea, the Australian Linguistic Society, the Association in the Associación Internacional de Linguística Appliquée, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. Before we start, I would like to say some words about our guest today. Ranjan Sen is a senior lecturer in linguistics at the University of Sheffield, UK. He completed his Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford in 2009, and he is author of the monograph Syllable and Segment in Latin, 2015, based on his doctoral thesis. He has published Reconstructing Phonological Change, Duration, and Syllable Structure in Latin Vowel Reduction in 2012 in Phonology, examining the life cycle of phonological processes, considerations for historical research in 2016 in the papers in historical phonology, and the Greco-Roman tradition in the forthcoming Oxford Handbook in the History of Phonology. He is a co-editor of the 2020 special issue of English Language and Linguistics, Studies in Late Modern English Historical Phonology, using the 18th century English phonology database. He was a visiting professor in phonology in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Toronto, Canada, and in 2014, and prior to joining the University of Sheffield in 2010, he was a teaching fellow at University College London in 2009 and 10, and a research associate and visiting lecturer at the University of Oxford. His main research focus these days is on testing the predictions of life cycle model through historical and experimental study. We invite the audience to make questions in the chat. At the end of the lecture, we read the questions and our guests can answer them. Questions can be made also in Portuguese. So I thank Abralim for this series. Dr. Ranjan, we thank you for accepting the invitation, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Jean, and many thanks to the organizers of this marvelous series in troubled times, and also to the Linguistic Association of Great Britain for the invitation to speak. As Jean said, My topic today is on the role of grammar in sound change. My title, Feeling the Irresistible Latin Beat, referring to rhythmic structure in an ancient language. Now, it is more than a century since Ferdinand de Saussure published his, was published posthumously, the Cours de linguistique générale in 1916, where he was an advocate of the position that language is a formal and arbitrary system, and that a complete understanding of a language required an understanding of that language's structures and systems, i.e. a synchronic view of language. This was at a time in the heyday, after the late 19th century, of historical comparative linguistics and the great advances made by, for example, the neogrammarian tradition. However, this focus on synchrony set the stage for arguably a lot of the 20th century, and especially the late 20th century with the rise of generative grammar and generative phonology. And as a result, the two paths, the historical comparative path and the synchronic view of old languages or older states of languages, seem to have taken divergent routes for several years, with some notable exceptions in the 20th century. And these exceptions, including works by scholars such as Kiparsky and Drescher and Lahiri, ask the question of the role of synchronic structure, the structure of the language at a snapshot in time, its workings and its rules, what role that played in diachronic development, in historical change over time. And conversely, the other question of what role diachronic development, sound change, phonological change over time, played in the language's synchronic structure at a snapshot in time. These questions have led to inform the discipline of theoretical historical phonology, which has always, as I say, always been there with some great outstanding examples, and has really taken some advances in the last 10, 20 years with various theories such as the development and use of this life cycle model that I'll talk a little bit about today, and the development of other models such as evolutionary phonology and exemplar theory. The two positions can be distilled into two extremes, which we'll label reductionists versus non-reductionists, adapting the titles used by Bermúdez-Otero in 2006. Essentially, reductionists' view of language change or sound change is that the constraints of speaking and hearing alone guide sound change. So the constraints of the vocal anatomy, as well as aerodynamics and the timing of articulatory gestures, as well as the acoustic properties of the sounds and the speech perception system. These alone should guide sound change, and this sort of approach has gathered momentum over the last 3 decades throughout the work of John O'Hala and in the work of Blevins under the rubric of evolutionary phonology. So the approach here is that synchrony, what is synchronic linguistics? Well, synchronic linguistics copes with diachrony. The synchronic learner, the learner of a language, a first language learner at any given time, has the input that they receive, the ambient input from whatever they're hearing from their parents, caregivers, and peers, and will construct a mental synchronic grammar based on that. The opposite approach, which I'll take the label non-reductionists for, I could have labeled as structuralists, but that label comes with a lot of historical baggage, so let's call them non-reductionists, who argue that change is driven and constrained by that mental linguistic structure. And this is the prevalent approach stemming from 20th century generative phonology, which can be seen in the work for many decades of Paul Kiparsky. And here we can see that synchrony guides diachrony. Sound change does not happen without any regard to the mental synchronic linguistic system, the structure. A third way is an amphicronic approach, using both kinds of approach. And this is taken root in the model that I'll be exploring today, the life cycle of phonological changes, given that it begins with the notion, the premise that that sound changes themselves have a lifespan. They don't just happen in a vacuum, blind to everything else. They start, they progress, and then they might end. Well, they usually do end. And so this takes some reductionist aspects. For example, the idea that the constraints of speaking and hearing alone guide sound change. Well, that is posited to occur at the start of a process, when a process is in its infancy, the start of a sound change, as might be expected. How might sound change start? Well, to do with speaking and listening. But then these non-reductionist aspects, changes driven and constrained by mental linguistic structure, also seem to have a place. And the place within this model is that they have an effect as the process ages. The sound change becomes increasingly embedded into the grammar of the language, the phonological structure of the language and the phonological processing system of the language as the process ages, and becomes increasingly sensitive to other aspects of the grammar, for example, morphosyntax, morphology, syntax. So we might summarize this approach as synchrony may come to constrain diachrony as the process ages. The model that I'll be working under in this paper is the life cycle of phonological processes, which is illustrated here. This is adapted from Bermúdez-Otero and Trousdale 2012. However, as I mentioned here, something akin to this kind of model has been recognized for well over a century, since Baudouin de Courtenay, 1895, at the end of the 19th century. And the idea is that sound changes become more and more sensitive to morphosyntax as they age. Now, this diagram shows how a speaker, what's going on in the mind of a speaker during speech production. So they might start at the top here with retrieving lexical items from the mental lexicon, and then they'll put them through, the speaker will put the item through 3 phonological grammars, 3 phonological stages. One will be a stem level grammar, where phonological changes and processes will apply to a stem, lexical stem. Then a word level grammar, where these phonological processes will apply to phonological words, so words including any suffixes or prefixes. Finally, a third phonological grammar will take effect, and that is the phrase level grammar. And that looks at the entire utterance. So, for example, in a phrase level grammar, phonological processes might be seen to work across word boundaries, but that would not be the case in a word level or a stem level grammar. Further to the phrase level grammar, instructions are then sent to the articulators to realize the phonological output into speech. Now, what happens diachronically, historically? Well, the sound changes, the life cycle seems to take the opposite path. They start off as phonetic effects in speech, and then they will rise through stabilization to the phrase level, and then undergo what is labeled domain narrowing to the word and stem levels, before becoming just learnt forms by a learner of the language and becoming static fossilized items in the mental lexicon. And by that stage, the phonological process no longer exists. The pattern is remaining as a residue in the mental lexicon. So we can consider what happens with a diagram. I mean, here is the initial state of speech. Think of the white dots as phonetically fairly short vowels and the black dots as phonetically slightly longer vowels. There are some phonetic environments where vowels tend to be lengthened, tend to be slightly longer than other environments. Let's imagine that the black dots are appearing in those environments and the white dots are appearing in other environments. So this is the initial state, just automatic phonetic realization constrained by the mechanics of speaking and the speech perception system. These might undergo phonologization, and that means they come under speaker control, cognitive control of the speaker, unconscious cognitive control of the speaker, in that they might start exaggerating this pattern. So in those environments where a vowel tends to be longer, the speaker might end up exaggerating that pattern to a greater degree than would be expected by simple environmental factors. This is known as phonologization. And here the process enters the phonology. At this stage, we might have what is known as a gradient rule or neogrammarian rule, a new phonetic rule that will simply apply to every lexical item where that sound occurs in the right environment. Further to phonologization, we might have stabilization. At this point, the rule becomes a categorical rule. So here, the speaker, in the mind of a speaker, there is a categorical process to replace one variant of the sound with another variant of the sound. So here, there would be a categorical rule of vowel lengthening in this particular environment. Here we have the old category, which contains the short vowel, and the new category, the categorically long vowel. Okay. Here, the rule is no longer gradient. There are two distinct categories. And this occurs at the phrase level, as might be expected, because the entire utterance is where is the domain of phonetics too. Phonetics won't be seeing the word boundaries, and so when it comes into the categorical phonology, the first stage it will go into is the phrase level, where word boundaries are not visible. So processes can occur across word boundaries. Then the process undergoes domain narrowing, so becomes invisible to word boundaries and is only takes effect within a word. So that's where it goes into the word level, undergoing domain narrowing. This is known as input restructuring. It then undergoes a second domain narrowing to the stem level, where the phonological process only takes effect within a stem. Here you can see that the sound change, which started off in phonetics, is becoming increasingly sensitive to morphosyntactic structure, the morphological structure of a word. Finally, at the end of a life cycle, the process ceases to be part of the dynamic computational aspects of the language's grammar and becomes part of the lexicon, the mental lexicon, or it could become a morphological operation, which is something we can set aside for the purposes of this paper. And there we can say that the sound change has ended. It has run its life cycle. Let's have a look at a concrete example of this life cycle. A well-known example is English G deletion after velar nasals at the end of stems, as discussed by Bermúdez-Otero and Trousdale, and very interestingly, more recently in the PhD thesis by George Bailey. Here we can see evidence for all the stages of the life cycle, starting in early modern English, going up to present day English, early modern English at stage 0 here, present day English in stage 3. In early modern English, there was no categorical phonological rule deleting the G in these, in what's seen as a spelling in NG, these NG sequences, which is velar nasal plus velar voiced velar plosive, ng. So we see it in monomorphemic items, single morpheme items like elongate or finger. We would see it in words with suffixes, so at the word level, prolonger, prolongate. Across word boundaries, the G would still be there, and prolong at utterance end, the G would still be there. Now, Elphinstone gives us evidence in the 18th century for two kinds of registers, a formal register and a casual register. Elphinstone's formal register reflects the pattern we would expect of a phrase level phonological rule. Here, G deletion occurs, phrase finally, or where the word prolong or sing is followed by a consonant, so the G stays in the coda. So the G remains in a coda and is a target of G deletion, a syllable coda. So here we have elongate, prolonger, prolongate, because it is followed by a vowel. So the G can be resyllabified as the onset of the following syllable, prolongate, but then prolong with G deletion. The process then undergoes domain narrowing to the word level in Elphinson's casual register. And here we can see that it is that it only looks within words. It will not look across word boundaries. The G resyllabification, to be the onset of that syllable in prolong it, doesn't no longer occurs. And we have prolong it rather than prolong it. Finally, in present-day English, we see it's gone one stage further, another domain narrowing to the stem level. So even before a vowel initial suffix, the G is deleted. So we have prolonger rather than prolonger. But note that the G will remain in monomorphemic items like elongate and finger. And this gives us that nice little contrast between words like finger with the G pronounced and singer with the G not pronounced. The life cycle model makes a number of interesting predictions. And although it's been around for a long time, it's still, I suppose, in recent research, it has really gathered pace in terms of some of the predictions, which I'll discuss in a moment. But there remains a lot to be tested regarding this model. And some of the things I've discussed in the paper cited here, I'll highlight on this slide here. So, for example, rule aging. Older rules should be at higher levels. Older rules in the language, so rules, processes that occurred in the language earlier, should have gone higher up into the grammar. So, for example, we often see milder lenition rules start before more extreme lenition rules. So therefore, we might see a milder lenition rule having gone up the grammar. At the same time, a new lenition rule, which is more extreme, weakening sounds more extremely, might just be starting on its life cycle. So we might see a stem level milder lenition versus a phrase level more extreme lenition. And this has indeed been illustrated in English, British English, L darkening and vocalization, where the milder L darkening is has risen to the stem level, whereas L vocalization, the pu, thiu, the u pronunciations that we find in, say, Cockney English, remains a phrase level rule. Okay. So we might say pu, but feel, but feel it. Okay. Secondly, we might find dialect microtypologies. So different dialects could be at different stages in the life cycle. And this might be expected. We see dialects related in the way they, in the extremeness of phonological changes sometimes. This is just another instantiation of that effect. Different dialects might exhibit the same process, but it might be at the stem level in one dialect and at the word level another and the phrase level another. And this has been investigated in Ibero-Romance nasal velarization by Michael Ramsamy. We also see the possibility of dialect continua where space may reflect time. So we might see a process that started in a geographical center and then spread outwards. But by the time it's reached the peripheries, the process has risen from a phrase level, say, to a stem level rule at the center, but the peripheries, it is still a phrase level rule. This can be seen in Swiss German O-lowering, and also more recently shown in Gallic pre-aspiration by Pavel Yosad. A very strong prediction is that there should not be any phonetically and lexically or morphologically gradient changes. So phonetics and morphology should not be sensitive to each other because they don't share an interface in this model. Lexicon is further up, the phonetics is at the bottom. This prediction has been challenged by some very interesting research on U fronting in English and L darkening by Patricia Strikarchuk and Jim Scobie. But that pattern can be explained within the life cycle model as shown by Bermúdez-Otero, again more recently. We expect domain narrowing. We expect processes to go upwards, not downwards. We do not expect domain broadening. Why is that? Well, only domain narrowing reduces morpheme alternation. So the number of forms a single morpheme can take. And it is hypothesized that a learner will, if anything, reduce morpheme alternation, make life simpler for themselves rather than have to memorize different alternants of the same morpheme. Now, this is a prediction which should be replicable experimentally. Our postgraduate student, Lauren Moon, here at the University of Sheffield, started some work on this, which unfortunately I would have hoped to present some more results from that at this talk, but sadly, because of the lockdown, we were unable to go ahead with the actual experiment. But there's some very interesting stimuli that are available, which we hope to implement at some point, using an artificial language learning experiment to see if under experimental conditions, speakers will make errors that are conducive to domain narrowing, but will not make errors that are conducive to domain broadening. It's yet, therefore, to be tested. But in theory, that prediction is experimentally testable, and I hope to present that at some point. A final prediction is dual morphosyntactic conditioning, which is something I'll discuss in a bit more detail in this paper. The idea that morphosyntax can affect a sound change in two different ways, through the life cycle and through prosodic structure. So moving on to the topic for the talk. The talk is on the subject of iambic shortening in early Latin. Iambic shortening is a terrific process in Latin which has yielded plenty of scope for research, both in the philological tradition. It is possibly one of the earliest puzzles seen in the philological tradition that is yet to be satisfactorily solved. So as you can see from Müller, 1869 onwards, up to Fortson, 2008 and onwards. But interestingly, it has also reared its beautiful head at crucial junctures in developments in phonological theory. For example, the development of metrical phonology and the development of optimality theory. So part of my quest today is to show that it's at the forefront of yet another theoretical phonological development, in that it provides very good evidence in favor of a stratal synchronic phonology and the life cycle model. I'm going to investigate three key predictions of the life cycle model. First of all, that synchronic constraints must be stratal, must be layered, right? There must be three grammars. And that results in opacity, meaning there are phonological processes which don't appear to be surface true because they have undergone processes at an earlier level of the phonology. The second prediction is the life cycle and domain narrowing. Here we see evidence for the process going from the phrase level to the word level, finally becoming lexicalized, becoming a static item in the grammar. In the mental lexicon. And finally, there's evidence for dual morphosyntactic conditioning, and I'll argue that this process, Latin iambic shortening, is phonological phrase internal. So it's sensitive to prosodic structure as well. Latin iambic shortening is an optional process in early Latin, and by early Latin, I mean mainly in the comic plays of Plautus in the 3rd to the 2nd centuries BC. There is plenty of good evidence to suggest that it is a real Latin phenomenon based on evidence of authors describing it, including Cicero, and making jokes about it, and also because of forms that ended up shortened, undergoing iambic shortening, that have got into the Romance languages in that shape. So before I move on to iambic shortening itself, let us just look at the foot structure that's required to analyze the process. Feet are units of rhythm, so bundles of syllables, or indeed single syllables. Latin feet are moraic trochees. That means that they are left-headed, which means that the leftmost element of a rhythmical unit, d-d, is the head. Left-headed is the stronger. They are moraic trochees. A mora is a unit of weight. So we can have a light a syllable or a heavy syllable. A light syllable I'll label L, a heavy syllable I'll label H. So a moraic trochee is a foot that contains two moras. So this could be instantiated as either light, light, da-da, that kind of rhythm, or a single heavy syllable, which is bimoraic, contains 2 units of weight. So for example, a light syllable could be an open syllable with a short vowel containing a short vowel. So for example, a syllable that's a vowel on its own, or consonant vowel, or consonant-consonant vowel with a complex onset. Or it could be a heavy syllable, a long vowel syllable, or a diphthongal syllable, or a syllable that is closed, i.e. has a syllable coda. So consonants after the vowel within the syllable. So any closed syllable will be heavy as well. In Latin, the word final syllable is extrametrical, which means it remains unfooted. This is for the purposes of stress assignment. The well-known penultimate law of Latin stress assignment demonstrates that the final foot must be ignored, the final syllable must be ignored when assigning stress. So Latin stress is either on the penultimate syllable or the antepenultimate syllable. This is broken in monosyllables because there's nowhere else to put the stress, and in light, light dissyllables because we can't create a bimoraic foot unless we put that last syllable into a foot. So that light, light dissyllable is a foot in itself. Feet are then formed left to right in the word, and the last foot in the word bears the primary stress, and this gives us the well-known penultimate law of Latin stress. The other feet in the word bear secondary stress. So to illustrate, a word like inimicus, enemy, will be stressed in this way: light, light, heavy, heavy. So the final kus, heavy, is unfooted for stress assignment. The mi before it is a heavy syllable, so it is a foot in its own right. It is the final foot in the word, so it bears primary stress. The foot before it is light, light, inni, and the first syllable of that bears secondary stress, inimicus, enemy. So Latin iambic or and cretic shortening, I'll come on to that in a moment, is a real feature of early spoken Latin, as I mentioned earlier. Essentially what happens is that a sequence of light, heavy is treated as light, light under iambic shortening, or it could be termed iambic lightning. A light, heavy sequence is treated as light, light. And this can be clearly seen mainly in verse scansion in Plautine poetry. So for example, a word like homo, human, is treated as homo, with that long vowel in the last syllable shortened to o. So homo, which I've shown with the IPA length marker, or, is treated as homo, short. Similarly, a closed syllable, test, closed syllables should be heavy, but under iambic shortening, that closed syllable can be treated as light. So potest can be treated as potest. Okay, I can't articulate the difference, but the second syllable in the Latin poetry will be treated as light. Okay, I'm going to term that as prosodic word iambic shortening, because that is a single disyllabic word with a light, heavy shape where the second syllable is shortened. That's prosodic word iambic shortening. A second type is word initial iambic shortening, and this is where the light, heavy sequence appears at the start of a word, a start of a longer word. And that light, heavy sequence at the start of the word is lightened to light, light. So we have a word like were bamini, where we have were, light, heavy at the start of the word. That could be treated as were bamini, you were afraid. And similarly, it might not be a vowel that is actually shortening, it might be a closed syllable that is treated as light. So voluptatem, desire accusative, could be treated as volup, which is light, light at the start, instead of light, heavy as it ought to be because of the closed syllable. A third kind of iambic shortening is known as cretic shortening, due to the shape of the words that undergo it. These trisyllables that are heavy, light, heavy are treated as heavy, light, light. A heavy, light, heavy word is treated as heavy, light, light. So words such as dikito is treated as dikito, and dixerunt is treated as dixerunt, with a final syllable light instead of heavy. Finally, and crucially, the fourth type of iambic shortening is cross-word iambic shortening, where the light-heavy sequence is actually separated by a word boundary. And this is a large clue to where it is in the life cycle. As we mentioned earlier, phrase level is the only level where things could occur cross-word. So the light syllable ends one word and the heavy syllable starts the next, but then the sequence is treated as light, light. So this happens exclusively when shortening closed syllables. So sed ostendere, se should be resyllabified with the d becoming the onset of the following syllable. So se, dos, that dos is closed, so it should be heavy, but it's treated as light. Sedos, sedos, sed os tendere becomes sedos tendere. Similarly, just a two-word phrase like hicest, this is hicest. The kest bit should be heavy, but it's treated as light. So the question remains, what synchronic grammar can produce these four kinds of iambic shortening? What synchronic grammar can do that without having contradictions within the grammar itself? And remember that we also need to account for stress assignment accurately. I'll work within an optimality theory framework, given that this is the best way of formalizing that there are competing pressures in the language, and the final form produced is making the best of these competing pressures. So what are the pressures? There are pressures to have two mores or syllables per foot binarity, leaving the last syllable unfooted, that's non-finality. Respecting moras, so not lightening, not shortening things, that's max mora. So the grammar doesn't want to change things, doesn't want to get rid of moras, make things light, but it might have to in order to satisfy more important pressures, constraints. Similarly, WSP, weight to stress principle, make heavy syllables into heads. The head foot right constraint says the last foot is the main foot, the head foot, and bears primary stress. Clash, avoid adjacent heads, so don't put stresses next to each other. And the stress to weight principle, heads are heavy. I'll highlight which of these are relevant in the discussion as we go along. Okay. Now, one of the main motivations for iambic shortening is to parse more syllables into feet. So this constraint, parse a syllable. So we want to put more syllables into feet. So we're trying to reduce trapped light syllables that can't be put into feet. So for example, in homo, we have a sequence of light, heavy. The last syllable can't have stress, so it becomes just trapped. So in order to, we have stress on the first syllable, as we do in disyllabic forms. So the last syllable is left unfooted. In order to foot it, we have to make it into a light syllable to make a biomeric trochee, light, light. Similarly, in something like voluptatem, if the wa was a light syllable, sorry, the wa is a light syllable, if the lup was treated as a heavy syllable, then it would be a foot in its own right, and we'd have voluptatem. Voluptatem would leave the wa unfooted at the start, a stranded light syllable. In order to put more syllables into feet, we can lighten the second syllable and start with a light, light sequence. Okay, so this constraint parse syllable seems to be extremely important in triggering iambic shortening. And crucially, it must be ranked, must be more important in the synchronic grammar than max mora. Keep things long that should be long. Okay. This results in opacity. A single level grammar that assigns stress correctly fails to predict correct shortening, and vice versa. So we talked about the well-known Latin penultimate law. The grammar that's required to encode that cannot also encode iambic shortening correctly. Let me illustrate. If parse syllable is ranked over max mora, then this ranking is impossible in word forms that don't show iambic shortening. So for example, words shaped light, heavy, and then a final syllable. So trisyllables shaped light, heavy syllable. These are not targets for iambic shortening. Where you get word initial iambic shortening, it has to be in a longer word. So words like amicus, friend, excuse me, is stressed amicus with stress on that second syllable, which is heavy. If we wanted to parse more syllables into feet, what could we have done? Well, we could have lightened that second syllable and made it short and incorporated that first syllable into the foot to make amicus. but that does not happen in Latin. But if we have a grammar that has parsed syllable ranked over max mora, this would be predicted. This gives us an opaque interaction between stress assignment and shortening, suggesting that they can't be happening at the same level of the grammar. Okay, amicus gives us incorrect stress and incorrect shortening. Similarly, words ending in heavy, light, and then a final syllable would also be predicted to undergo shortening. So amiciter, in a friendly manner, amiciter, that would either be predicted to yield amiciter, parsing another syllable, one of the light syllables there, amiciter, predicting incorrect shortening, or even this curious amiciter, which gives you incorrect stress assignment on the first syllable rather than the second, and also incorrect shortening. Thirdly, words with word initial LH but without a following stressed syllable. This again these are not targets for iambic shortening in Latin. Words like fidelitatem, faithfulness, fidelitatem. Okay, the grammar with parsed syllable over max mora would predict something like fidelitatem, with lightening of the de to dare to de, or even fidelitatem, which is wonderful for parsing. You've parsed all the syllables apart from the final one, but that's not what actually happened in Latin. Okay, so this grammar is producing incorrect results. The same grammar that does shortening cannot be the same grammar that does stress assignment. Another example of that is that parsed syllable must be ranked over non-finality in the shortening grammar, because we seem to be able to parse final syllables in order to create nice feet if we shorten the final syllable. For example, in Cretic shortening, di kito, kito. Usually we wouldn't parse that final syllable, but di kito with a long final syllable becomes di kito. Okay, so this also cannot be correct in the stress assignment grammar. It's correct for the iambic shortening grammar, but not the stress assignment grammar. It yields incorrect results like pueritia, pueritia, which is not how it would be stressed in Latin. This also highlights the demotion of head, foot, right. The final foot of the word is usually the head foot, the one that bears primary stress, but this can't be the case in the lightning grammar, because stress stays where it was before we footed that final syllable. Okay, so di kito had stress on the first syllable of a trisyllable, and it stayed on that first syllable even when we footed that final syllable by shortening it. Di kito into di kito. Okay, so there is clear evidence that primary stress is assigned first, and then at a later level in the grammar we have iambic shortening, or this lightening, this syllable lightening. And that lightening respects earlier stress assignment. This seems to bear out one of the predictions of the life cycle model, that that synchronic structure is stratal, has levels. And it appears that the stress assignment is occurring at the word level, whereas iambic shortening is happening at the phrase level. At the word level, we form feet. We form feet within words. We assign primary stress to the final foot of each word. The final syllable is extrametrical, is not considered for stress assignment. And so this gives us parses like le, and then go, left unparsed. Di, kito, left unparsed. Volupta, tem, final syllable left unparsed. And across word boundaries, it would be et, one word, abdu kere. Okay. But what happens at the phrase level? Well, not having the extrametricality is a strong clue to where this lightening is happening. So it must be happening at the phrase level, because this is where that final syllable does come into play, as shown by cross-word scansion, resyllabification across word boundaries, elision across word boundaries, and phrasal iambic shortening. So lots of well-known processes in Latin happen across word boundaries, and iambic shortening is one of them in Plautine Latin. Here, foot formation occurs across word boundaries, and lightening is permitted. Lightening occurs in order to permit more parsing of syllables into feet. The final syllable becomes available. So here at the phrase level, we have parses like lego, dicito, voluptatem, and et abducere. from et abducere as the result, with that ab, which should be a heavy syllable, just treated as light, tab. The next stage, the next prediction that we're going to test of the life cycle model is diachrony, in that this process, as it ages, should undergo domain narrowing. And we do indeed see this. We see evidence of domain narrowing from the phrase level to the word level in iambic shortening. We also catch the end of the process. We catch the process becoming lexicalized, i.e. becoming the fixed mental representations of certain words, of certain lexical items that then are taken on into later Latin and into the Romance languages. So in early Latin verse, such as in Plautus, the process, as we've seen, the grammar that we've constructed so far, was at the phrase level. It occurred across words. It occurred with resyllabification of final consonants. It occurred after stress assignment and bore no interaction with that, except for respecting stress assignments that had already been made at the word level. However, as the process goes on, in early, what are known as popular verse inscriptions, so demonstrating a more innovative, advanced grammar, the process seems to have advanced to the word level. It becomes limited to single words of iambic shape, just as we would expect if it was a word level process. And then the first of the 4 types of iambic shortening is then the only one that has effect. So that prosodic word iambic shortening is the only one that we see from these later early popular verse inscriptions. We don't see evidence for any cretic shortening, heavy, light, heavy becoming heavy, light, light, or word initial iambic shortening, or cross-word iambic shortening. And the reason for this is that the interactions involved in those iambic shortening are you might say more opaque. It's not something I'm going to go into in this paper, but there are fewer cues for the learner to discern the reason behind those, as opposed to the prosodic word iambic shortening, which the learner could interpret as a word level process. And we see an interaction then with stress assignment, because both stress assignment and iambic shortening are happening at the word level. So what seems to be happening here is that we avoid light heavy as the main stressed foot in the word. So there's an interaction between stress and lightening, as we'd expect where 2 processes are at the same level. Later on, the process ages further. Instead of undergoing further domain narrowing to the stem level, what we do have evidence for is a further restructuring at the word level. In later Republican and Imperial verse, we see iambic shortening only occurring through the shortening of long vowels and not through the lightening of closed syllables anymore, only through the shortening of long vowels. So the amor becoming amo, or lego becoming lego, sorry. So the shorter vowel in that final syllable, not the potest type where the test is treated as a light syllable anymore. That variety seems to disappear. This shows evidence of increased structuralization, referring to syllables, referring to syllable shape. So elements of the prosodic hierarchy here, the syllable are coming to play a role in the workings of the process. And this is something I'll come on to when I'm testing my 3rd prediction, Dualmorphosyntactic conditioning, the influence of prosody. Okay. Finally, at the end of the process, we see lexicalization. It's reached the end of the life cycle. In Imperial Latin, some shortened forms have become standard in classical Latin. Forms such as bene, well, male, badly, modo, only, cave, beware, ego, I, and mihi, tibi, sibi, me, you, and him, dative. And these become what you might think of as the fossilized, the memorized, the learned lexical forms of these words. So an infant learner of Latin at this stage will simply learn these as the word. They won't learn them as bene and also learn a process of iambic shortening. And of course, as might be predicted by the life cycle model, it is only the long voweled forms with prosodic word iambic shortening that underwent lexicalization, not word initial iambic shortened forms, not crossword iambic shortened forms, not critically shortened forms either, just these disyllabic long voweled words. And why is that? Because those are the only ones still undergoing iambic shortening at the end of the life cycle of the process. So they were the only ones that were available for lexicalization at the end of the day. These forms might might be very frequent forms, might reflect high token frequency as postulated by Devine and Stevens. Okay, so here we see an item by item lexicalization of these words, and this conforms to classical lexical diffusion, where a sound change goes through the lexicon item by item instead of affecting all words at once, which would be the neogrammarian version of sound change. Okay, the beauty of the life cycle model is that it has a place for both. At the start of the process, it is a phonetic rule affecting all words, regardless of what word it is, because it only looks at phonetics and phonological environments. And at the end of the process, we're looking at individual lexical items word by word. Okay, classical lexical diffusion. The third and final prediction of the model that I want to explore is dual morphosyntactic conditioning. It's been pointed out by Bermúdez-Otero and Luis that it's difficult to distinguish between two kinds of morphosyntactic conditioning in phonology. One is the one we've been discussing today so far, the computational influence of morphosyntax because of these cyclic domains, stem level, word level, phrase level. And these domains are coextensive with grammatical constituents. The stem level occurs at the grammatical stem, the word level coextensive with the grammatical word, and the phrase level and the utterance. So for example, a phonological environment final, so underscore hash denoting finally, that can be stem final if it's at the stem level, word final if it's the word level, or phrase final if it's the phrase level. So we need to pay attention to morphosyntax to work out where this phonological process is applying. But a second influence of morphosyntax on phonology might be not computational, but representational via prosodic structure. Because prosodic structure, an item on the prosodic hierarchy from syllables to feet, to prosodic words, to phonological phrases, etc., can be conditioned by grammatical constituents. Conditioned insofar as they might even be coextensive with these, but may not be quite coextensive with syntactic constituents. For example, the syllables might align to grammatical morphemes. This is illustrated nicely in Latin, in fact, with the syllabification of plosive plus liquid sequences. So sequences of consonants like p, t, k, b, d, g, followed by r or l. If they are in monomorphemes or in not with discernible prefixes, they will be syllabified as tautosyllabic complex onsets. So the genitive of pater, father, is patris, patris, with a tr syllabified as the onset of the syllable. However, when a morpheme boundary intervenes between the plosive and the liquid, say the b and the r in ab ripio, okay, the syllable boundary will lie where the morpheme boundary lies. So morphology affects phonology here. The syllable boundary respects the morpheme boundary, ab ripio. So not patris, but patris. Not ab ripio, but ab ripio. Similarly, prosodic words, the phonological variant of a word, the phonological view of a word could be coextensive with a grammatical word. A phonological phrase, a unit above a word, a grouping of words, which we label with the Greek letter phi, could be coextensive with a syntactic phrase, an XP, so an NP, a noun phrase, a verb phrase, a VP, or an adjectival phrase, an AP. And higher up the hierarchy, it could be a phonological intonational phrase, which we denote with the Greek letter iota, could be constructed on a syntactic clause. So something higher in the syntactic tree, a CP or TP. So we can see two possible effects of morphosyntax on phonology through the cycle and through prosodic structure. So, for example, a thought experiment here: if we see a change occurring word finally, is it because the environment is final _ at the word level, or is it because the environment is final in the prosodic unit, prosodic word? Okay, is it just final and it's at the word level, or is the rule saying it's final in prosodic word? And that could be at the word level, or it could be at the phrase level. A third possibility is not an either or, but could it be both? Dual morphosyntactic conditioning. And we might expect this. I mean, prosodic structure being influenced by morphosyntax is everywhere, and the life cycle seems to be everywhere. So in a way, we might even expect dual morphosyntactic conditioning to be close to everywhere, to be much wider spread than we have noticed so far. Okay, and taking this notion seems to be very useful in looking at Latin iambic shortening. So what seems to happen is that shortening is sensitive not only to stratal computational procedure, but also prosodic representational structure. So here we have the higher levels of the prosodic hierarchy in phonology: the utterance, made up of intonational phrases, made up of phonological phrases, made up of prosodic words. What seems to be happening is that iambic shortening occurs within phonological phrases, Greek phi, which were not heads of their intonational phrases, the iotas, in feet which were not heads of those prosodic words, which were heads of their phonological phrases. That's a rather complicated formulation. I'll work through that in the next slide. But you can see from the wording that iambic shortening seems to be happening in non-prominent positions. The prosodic conditions for iambic shortening seem to follow this this kind of question tree. So is the light-heavy sequence, the LH sequence, is it found across different phis, different phonological phrases? If yes, we do not get shortening. It is phi internal. It occurs within a single phonological phrase. So if the light-heavy sequence is across phonological phrases, you won't get shortening. If no, we need to ask, is the light-heavy sequence in the head phonological phrase of an intonational phrase? The head phonological phrase of an intonational phrase is either the final one by default or an earlier one if it is a focused element. If yes, there is no shortening. It is prominent. If no, we ask, is the light-heavy sequence in the head prosodic word in a phonological phrase? Again, the head prosodic word in a phonological phrase is either the final by default or a focused element earlier in the phonological phrase. If no, we ask a different question. If yes, we have to ask an intermediate question. Is it in the head foot in the prosodic word? If yes, there is no shortening. If no, we come to our final question. Is it across different feet at the phrase level, in our phrase level footing? Is it across different feet? If yes, there is no shortening because it is foot internal, because the whole point of iambic shortening is to create this light foot. If it is not across different feet at the phrase level, then iambic shortening is possible. Remember, it is still an optional process in early Latin, but this is the environment where iambic shortening becomes possible. So we might ask how we form phonological phrases. There are various theories on how to do this, including an aligned theory. The theory I'm going to briefly implement is match theory by Lisa Selkirk, a theory of the syntax-phonology interface. Here, phonological phrases are formed in an isomorphic fashion to lexical phrasal prediction, so noun phrases, verb phrases, and adjectival phrases. So these syntactic phrases form the template, the basis on which to form the phi, the phonological phrase, according to this match XP constraint. If you want to put it into optimality theory, the left and right edges of a constituent of a type XP in the input syntactic representation must correspond to the left and right edges of constituent phi in the output phonological representation. And then after this matching, there will be, or in optimality theory, along with this matching, there will be purely phonological markedness constraints to respect to, for example, rhythmic binarity constraints. So that might result in non-isomorphism between the NP and the phi, say, or the VP and the phi. Okay, I'm not going to go into that complication here, but let us have a look at the advantages of the formulation that we've given, that iambic shortening is phi internal and in non-prominent position. By doing so, we address Fulton's 2008 concern that although the effects of phrasal stress have been widely assumed to cause iambic shortening in normally fully stressed lexemes, and many examples of the phenomenon noted, to my knowledge, it has never been systematically examined, and the literature is very vague about the conditions or description of the phenomenon. What we try to do is not be vague and to give a precise formulation of the conditions of the phenomenon, as we've done in the preceding slide. The phi internal analysis of iambic shortening explains several findings in decades-long philological, in decades-long philological literature. By philology, I mean here in the British sense of comparative and historical linguistics. So, one, it has often been noted that there's a close syntactic connection between the two words involved in cross-word iambic shortening, as noticed by Cuesta, Subiran. Why? Because it is a phi internal phenomenon. So this again addresses Fulton's criticism that accounts invoking syntactic constraints have hitherto lacked explicit testable formulation. So from Fulton again, none of the other authors who have invoked close syntactic connection have attempted to define what they mean by that phrase or give any hierarchy or degrees of closeness such as the claim can be scientifically tested. We can do this if we use models of the syntax phonology interface where phis are constructed on syntactic phrases. Secondly, words in which optional iambic shortening occurred at its highest rate were those which may have had reduced or zero stress in phrasal acoustic troughs, so positions of low prominence. Why? In our formulations, because they're not in the head phi, the head phonological phrase of an intonational phrase, or the head foot in a head prosodic word. Avoid heads. Okay. Thirdly, shortening never occurred in a light-heavy sequence when the light was followed by a full word boundary, i.e., for example, the end of a syntactic phrase. Why? Because it is phi internal, so the light-heavy sequence must all be in the same phonological phrase. Or even the heavy syllable in the light-heavy sequence was followed by a prose pause, and consequently its metrical equivalent, the end of a line. That's a quote from Fulton. So how do we explain that? Well, it's not in the head or the final, by default, prosodic word of the phonological phrase or the head phonological phrase of the intonational phrase. So therefore, even if the light heavy is in a single phonological phrase, that can't be at the end because that would be the head phonological phrase, which is also a position where we don't find iambic shortening. Finally, it didn't occur when it was a focused element. Again, a focused element would be a head prosodic word or a head phonological phrase. And those are environments where iambic shortening will not be occurring. Sorry, not finally. It was also a tendency in never occurring at the end of a clause. So not in the head phi of an I, not in the head phonological phrase of an intonational phrase. The final phonological phrase of an intonational phrase was the head one by default. We might ask why we do find iambic shortening in two-word utterances which are only 2 words long, so there can only be one phonological phrase, and the entirety would be the phonological phrase, and therefore would be the head phonological phrase. So for example, we do find iambic shortening in things like quid est, what is it? For example, in Plautus's Casino. Surely that's the head phonological phrase and we shouldn't get iambic shortening there. Well, we can get around that if we think about utterances like this being non-prominent phrases in their entirety. For example, in English, we can see reduction of a phrase like what is up to what's up. Okay, the entire phrase has become formulaic and can undergo quite a serious reduction. Okay. Finally, let us look through an example from Plautus of how this actually works. We have from Plautus Trinomus 964, we have a dialogue between a character known as the sycophant and the main character known as Charmides. It's a hilarious dialogue. The sycophant doesn't know that Charmides is Charmides, so Charmides is pretending not to be Charmides. So the dialogue that we have, just one line is, well, Tracentis, spoken by the sycophant, and then switches to Charmides, haben tu idaurum quod accipisti a Charmide. So the sycophant says, you can even have 300 words with me. So Charmides has said, can I have a word with you? You can even have 300 words with me. And Charmides asks, have you that gold which you received from Charmides? Where the sycophant doesn't know Charmides is Charmides. This contains this noun phrase relative clause, aurum quod accipisti a Charmide. Quod accipisti, the quodac has undergone crossword iambic shortening. Ac should be a heavy syllable because it's closed, but it is being treated as light. Quodac is a sequence light, whereas it should be a sequence light heavy. So what has happened here? Sorry, the whole sentence haben tu idaurum quod accipisti a Charmide is an intonational phrase. And depending on your theories of syntax and of match theory, there may be other intonational phrases within that, but we won't worry about that. So what do we want to happen? We want the shortening light heavy to be a phrase level foot. We don't want it to be in the head phi of the iota, and indeed it's not, because the head is Charmide, the one at the end, nor is it the head foot of the head prosodic word in the phonological phrase. So we have syntactic lexical phrases. Aurum is a noun phrase on its own. Charmide is a noun phrase, and the whole aurum quod accipisti a Charmide, this restrictive relative clause, is a noun phrase as well. Crucially, there is no boundary between quod and accipisti. We match XP, we match those noun phrases onto phonological phrase boundaries. So aurum is a phonological phrase, Charmide is a phonological phrase, and the entire thing is a phonological phrase, a maximal phonological phrase. Okay, Charmide, I've put on that sort of double stress acute accent to show that this is now the final prosodic word and is the final phonological phrase. So this is bearing the main phrasal stress, Charmide. It also could be focused because of the joke that Charmides is pretending not to be Charmides. Okay, but either way, it is bearing that main stress, Charmide. Then we construct word level foot structure and we assign primary stresses to the words. So aurum, quod, accipisti a Charmide. And then finally, we assign phrase level foot structure. And here we can have consonant resyllabification across word boundaries. So the d of quod can be the onset of the syllable which would otherwise begin with a. So dak becomes a syllable. And we go undergo vowel elision across word boundaries. So tia, ja. Okay. And we end up also with iambic shortening. So we have aurum quod accipisti a Charmide. So aurum quod accipisti a Charmide. Okay, and that is exactly where we'd expect iambic shortening. It's exactly where we'd get iambic shortening according to the synchronic model that we've developed in the stratal structure, stratal synchronic grammar that we formulated earlier. So to summarize, the theoretical historical phonology will make testable predictions of the synchrony-diachrony interaction. The life cycle model accounts for regular and diffused gradient and categorical change and makes numerous interesting predictions requiring detailed testing. And that's an exciting prospect. Early Latin iambic shortening was at the phrase level in stratal synchronic computation with an opaque interaction with word level stress assignment. And it operated in phonological phrases in positions of low prosodic prominence, showing dual morphosyntactic conditioning. And it followed the expected life cycle, narrowing from the phrase level to the word level, and then we see evidence for it being lexicalized. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Ranjan, for the great lecture. lecture, and we have some questions here in the chat. The first one, I can make one by one, and you can answer.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. The first one is, are there in linguistic aspects to be considered so that we are able to predict which stress pattern in a context of variation will survive in a language? If you have some different patterns of stress in a language, you can predict which one will survive.
I see. Yes. Well, I mean, there has been very good work, some recent very good work by Ilan Drescher and Aditi Lahiri, looking at stress patterns over the history of English and the different influences from Norman French and Latinate influences and things like that, where there seem to be sort of competing pressures between putting sort of respecting bimeraic trochees and trochaic footing with words that are coming into the language with other stress patterns and then being incorporated not only as lexical items but into the grammar of that language, and therefore they change the computational aspects of that language's grammar. As for predicting what happens in results, sort of language contact results like that, there's some very interesting models there involving Young's tolerance principle, which is used by Drescher and Lahiri as well. Now, if there isn't a contact situation and simply there is variation, that would suggest that there are varying grammars within varying synchronic grammars within the language. What wins out might be the result of social linguistic factors and identification of variants with different social groups and spread from there. There could also be sort of internal pressures in other aspects of the language. If one footing is more amenable to other things that are going on in the language, then it could be supported. Or if there is a very strong tendency, say, to foot in a certain way, or to stress to stress heavy syllables, or then these kinds of pressures could influence what patterns remain and what patterns disappear. I mean, in early Latin, there seems to be some very unusual stress patterns in Plautine Latin, where the first of 3 light syllables is stressed, and these seem to be very peculiar. So in a word like bath, in Plautine Latin, we seem to have balineum rather than balineum, which would be expected in classical Latin. And balineum leads to a vowel synchrony, which is balneum. However, this stressing pattern disappears in Latin, in classical Latin, and we only get the famous penultimate law of Latin. Now, why that disappears could be because a reduction in the available types of foot structure within the inventory of Latin, within the phonological inventory of Latin. So learners took the input and they simplified the grammar and said, well, they didn't say, they sort of intuited that only certain foot structures were required, light, light, heavy, and the words that didn't seem to conform to that foot structure seemed to undergo stress shift and a different stress. So the simpler grammar resulted in the newer stress pattern. I hope that answers some of the questions.
Okay. And another question from Brenda Silva. She said that some scholars affirm there are different stress patterns in Portuguese, one for nouns and one for verbs. Is it common in a language or in the languages in general of the words to have 2 different patterns of stress?
Thanks. I would say that I confess I'm not a phonological typologist when it comes to stress patterns of the world's languages. So I wouldn't be able to answer with confidence how common it is. It is certainly the case that different syntactic categories, different word classes can display different phonological behavior. And that can be quite common across, I mean, that is seen to be fairly common across the world's languages. So yes, it would not be unheard of.
Okay.
Or entirely unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid I don't know many more about Portuguese or the particular pattern in question.
Another question about Portuguese also, because also for Brenda, scholars are not quite sure yet about the stress patterns of syllables and of words in Portuguese. Do you believe it happens due to the rich variety of possibilities that we have in the language? Stress can fall on the first and the second and on the third syllable from the right to left.
I see. So again, I confess I'm not a phonologist in Portuguese, so I wouldn't be able to answer with anything definitive. But yes, I mean, if we have a free stress language where stress can fall on any syllable, then the learner simply has to learn that as part of the lexical entry of the word. So the stress is lexicalized on a certain item of the word, and stress is not computational in those free stress languages, but it's memorized. So in that life cycle model, it'd be part of that lexicon at the top rather than part of the computation, as it is in Latin, where we saw stress assignment is at the word level. Stress assignment is at the word level in Latin, but as it was a predictable stress language. But in other languages, it would have to be memorized. It would have to be learnt as part of acquisition of lexical items.
Mm-hmm. We have also two questions from Bob Mellows. You have outlined a set of criteria for IS to occur in Latin. You also describe this to be random as to whether it will occur, given the criteria. Can you see over time how much penetration I think they need to continue now. Penetration IS had in the set. It is over time it penetrates to all members of the set. If not, does this suggest that there is another factor at play determining whether or not it occurs? I don't know if you can
absolutely.
understand that.
Yes, I do. It is not, first of all, it is not a random process. I mean, I labeled it as an optional process, and a lot of more than a century long of philological work has gone into where it is more likely and where it is less likely, what kind of environments, especially what kind of environments within the verse line, within Plautine scansion. And there definitely are, the questioner is quite right, there definitely are other considerations in place. In particular, in terms of versification and things like that. What I've presented are the morphophonological and the prosodic prerequisites for it happening at all. Within these environments, it is an optional process. Now, optional processes abound in phonology, and indeed, some of the evidence I was presenting earlier in terms of L darkening and things like that. Daniel Turden's work on L darkening in British English and Manchester English in particular shows that the best model is a stochastic grammar, probabilistic grammar, where there is a likelihood of a process occurring at the phrase level, a larger likelihood, a word level, a smaller likelihood, and the stem level, a smaller likelihood still. if this seems to be the best way of modeling changes like this. So yes, there could be other factors in place. It could actually simply be sensitive to a variety of other factors and speech registers and things like that. But then a lot of processes in language are simply probabilistic as well, and speakers choose to implement them sometimes, or I say choose, but unconsciously implement them sometimes and unconsciously don't at other times. So yes, there are other factors, but I've presented the absolute prerequisites from a grammar point of view.
Okay. Ranjan, I think that we have no more questions, and I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Aberlin for organizing this event, and I'd like to say to the audience that it's very important to associate to Berlin to support our field. And I'd like to thank the audience for making questions, for improving the debate here. And I would like to thank you, Ranjan, for the lecture, and I give you the opportunity to give your last words now.
Thank you again, Jan. I would like to thank Berlin again and the Linguistics Association of Great Britain for the invitation to speak. And may I say what a wonderful venture this is, and an incredible way to keep linguists across the world engaged in their discipline with a series of fantastic talks. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.